The plastic restraint bit into my wrists while my brother-in-law held a black steel bridge pin above his head like a trophy. Behind him, a row of investors stood beneath white tents on the shore of Table Rock Lake. Army officers filled the front seats. My mother was smiling. My father had already told the security guards not to be gentle with me. Preston Holt turned slowly, so every camera could see the pin in his hand. He had spent the morning telling the crowd that his company was about to win the largest military mobility contract in Missouri history. Now he pointed the pin at me as if it were a murder weapon. "Here is your saboteur," he shouted. Evelyn Mercer has hated this family for years. She stole a critical locking pin from our demonstration bridge and planted it in her own toolbox so she could blame us when the system failed. My sister Dana stepped close enough for me to smell her rose perfume. She slapped me across the face. The sound carried over the lake. Then she leaned toward the nearest camera and said the words she had probably practiced all night. "She is not a soldier. She changes oil in an army garage and tells people she is important." The crowd laughed. My mother covered her mouth, but not because she was shocked. She was trying to hide another smile. My father stared at the ground with the disappointed expression he had used on me since childhood, as if my existence had always been a stain he could not scrub from the family name. Preston ordered the guards to search my truck. One of them opened my battered green toolbox and pulled out a second steel pin wrapped in an evidence bag. Preston raised both arms in triumph. "There," he said. "Proof." That was the first shock. The second came from the demonstration bridge behind us. A deep metallic crack rolled across the water. The unmanned test vehicle stopped halfway over the floating span. One joint folded, then another. The center section dropped 6 feet and slammed against the safety barges below. Steel screamed. Cameras shook. Investors ran backward, spilling coffee and knocking over chairs. Preston stared at the collapsing bridge with his mouth open. The third shock came from Major General Miriam Cole. She rose from the front row, removed her sunglasses, and looked directly at the evidence bag in the guard's hand. "Nobody move," she said. Her voice was not loud, but every soldier on that shore froze. General Cole walked past Preston and stopped in front of me. She looked at the red crescent stamped into the head of the pin. Then she turned toward the federal agents waiting beside the command trailer. "Cut Chief Maddox free," she said. "That pin is evidence from a fatal Army accident, and she is the lead failure investigator assigned to this case." My mother stopped smiling. My father finally looked up. Preston lowered the pin, as if it had suddenly become hot enough to burn through his hand. "Before I tell you why my own family tried to frame me for a bridge collapse, take a moment to subscribe if stories about quiet people finally standing up mean something to you. And tell me where you were listening from. I read more of those comments than you might think. 2 days earlier, I drove my old Chevrolet pickup through the stone gates of Cedar Ridge Lodge. The engine had a soft knock at low speed, and the passenger window needed help from one hand before it would close. The valet looked past me toward the line of polished sport utility vehicles and assumed I had taken a wrong turn. I had not. A brass sign near the entrance read, "Holt Mobility Systems Leadership Weekend." Under those words was the slogan Preston used on every brochure. "We carry America forward." I parked my truck myself. The lodge sat above the lake on a high shelf of limestone. White tents covered the lawns. Temporary military bridges stretched across a protected inlet below. Engineers in matching blue jackets moved between equipment bays, while public relations people adjusted flags until every fold looked patriotic. The whole place smelled like wet cedar, coffee, diesel fuel, and money. I wore plain canvas work pants, a faded brown jacket, and boots with real grease in the seams. My gray hair was pulled into a short braid. I had no rank on my clothes. No unit patch. No ribbons. Nothing that would tell my family I had spent more than 3 decades in uniform. That was not an accident. My official travel orders placed me in Missouri as a senior warrant officer attached to an Army test directorate. My operational cover listed me as a civilian maintenance consultant from a regional depot. The distinction mattered because the Department of Defense Inspector General and Army investigators had been following Holt Mobility Systems for 7 months. Preston believed he had invited the family failure to his victory weekend. In reality, he had invited the person who could end his company before Sunday lunch. Inside the lodge, a hostess handed me a cream-colored envelope. My name had been written in blue ink, then crossed out with a thick black marker. Beneath it, someone had added 2 words: vendor seating. I looked across the ballroom. My parents sat at the center table beneath a chandelier made from antlers. Dana was wearing a pale gold dress and directing a photographer with small movements of her fingers. Preston stood beside her in a navy suit, one hand on her waist and the other on the shoulder of a senator's aide. My mother noticed me first. June Mercer had always been skilled at turning disappointment into theater. She let her eyes travel from my boots to my jacket, then she tilted her chin toward a folding table near the kitchen doors. I walked there without arguing. The table held 2 subcontractors, a delivery driver and a young woman wearing a catering uniform. The young woman looked familiar. It took me a second to recognize my niece, Paige. Paige was Dana's daughter. She was 23, quiet, and treated by her mother as if kindness were a minor character flaw. When she saw me, her face brightened for half a second. Then she glanced toward Dana and lowered her eyes. "Aunt Evie," she whispered, "I did not know you were coming." "Neither did your mother," I said. That was almost true. Paige slid a glass of water toward me. Her hand trembled. "You should leave before tomorrow," she said. I looked at her carefully. "Why?" She shook her head. Dana was watching. The dinner began with a video about American strength. Preston's voice filled the room while slow-motion footage showed armored vehicles crossing Holt bridges at sunset. The bridge in the video was called the Atlas Span. According to the narrator, it could be deployed by a small crew in less than half an hour and carry the Army's heaviest vehicles across rivers, bomb craters, and collapsed highways. According to the records I had reviewed, the Atlas Span had also failed 3 internal tests. 1 hinge had cracked under repeated load. 2 locking pins had deformed in cold weather. A subcontractor had reported inconsistent heat treatment in a batch of high-strength steel. That report disappeared before the company submitted its final certification package. Preston needed the Army contract to survive. Holt Mobility Systems looked powerful from the outside. Inside, the company was drowning. It had borrowed against 2 factories, pledged equipment as collateral, and guaranteed a private loan that came due in 6 weeks. The Atlas Span contract was worth $286 million over 5 years. Without it, Preston would lose the company, the lake house, the private aircraft, and most of the life my parents worshipped. That was his motive. It was not simple greed. Greed makes a man take too much. Panic makes him destroy anyone who can prove the truth. A server placed roast beef in front of me on a thin white plate. At the center table, Preston raised a crystal glass. "To family," he said. "The foundation of everything we build." My father stood and applauded. Vernon Mercer had retired from a small machine shop after 40 years. He understood steel. He understood tolerances. He also understood which child could improve his social standing. Dana had married a wealthy contractor. I had joined the Army after high school and stayed long enough to become a stranger. Preston continued speaking. "Some people inherit responsibility," he said. "Others run from it and hide behind a government paycheck." Several heads turned toward me. Dana smiled into her wine. I cut one piece of meat and chewed slowly. Preston loved reactions. He collected them. Anger made him feel powerful. Tears made him feel innocent. Silence made him nervous. So I gave him silence. A man named Curtis Vane approached my table carrying a glass of red wine. Curtis was Holt's vice president of testing. He had signed the certification documents that claimed every Atlas pin had passed inspection. He wore a silver watch worth more than my truck and a small American flag pin on his lapel. He stopped beside me. "I hear you work in a motor pool," he said. "Something like that. Then perhaps you can help us with a stain." He tipped the glass onto my jacket. The wine spread across the brown canvas in a dark red sheet. Paige gasped. The room went quiet for exactly 1 breath. Then laughter rose from Preston's table. Curtis looked down at his shoes. "You splashed me," he said. "Apologize. My father was beside us before I could reach for a napkin." "Do not embarrass your sister," Vernon said. "Say you are sorry." I looked at the wine dripping from my sleeve. Then I looked at Curtis's right hand. There was a narrow black line under his thumbnail. Manganese phosphate residue. The same coating used on the locking pins in the bridge assembly bay. Curtis had been handling production parts shortly before dinner, even though his job description placed him in executive testing, not assembly. That detail went into the quiet ledger in my head, I lifted my napkin and pressed it once against my sleeve. I am sorry your aim is poor, I said. Paige coughed into her hand to hide a laugh. Curtis's face tightened. My father grabbed my elbow. I turned my wrist outward and stepped half a pace to the side. His grip slipped without force. Years of moving around heavy equipment teach you how to protect your joints. Years in a family like mine teach you when not to explain. Vernon stared at his empty hand. I sat down again. Across the room, Major General Miriam Cole had watched the entire exchange. She was the senior Army guest for the weekend and the officer responsible for mobility modernization. Preston believed her presence meant the contract was almost his. General Cole did not look at the spilled wine. She looked at the way I had broken my father's grip. Then she looked at my boots. The left heel carried a thin stripe of pale clay from a restricted test range 2 counties away. She had been there that morning. Our eyes met for 1 second. She gave no sign of recognition. Neither did I. The next morning began in the equipment pavilion beside the lake. Preston called it Family Innovation Day. Employees called it Mandatory Humiliation with Catered Breakfast. The pavilion held 2 Atlas bridge modules, a hydraulic launching vehicle, and rows of polished tools arranged for photographs. Every wrench had been cleaned, every hose had been wiped, even the grease looked staged. Preston stood on a platform and explained that the first event would demonstrate mechanical readiness. Teams would identify and correct a simulated hydraulic fault in the bridge launcher. He pointed at me. Since Evelyn spends her days changing filters, perhaps she can show us what government efficiency looks like. The investors laughed on cue. Dana crossed her arms. Try not to break anything, she said. These machines cost more than your pension. I walked toward the launcher. A young Holt engineer named Mason Lee stood beside the control panel. He looked embarrassed. The fault light is active, he said quietly. Pressure drops when the deployment arm moves past halfway. Preston started a timer. I did not open the main valve block. That was what they expected. Instead, I crouched near the return line and placed 2 fingers against the steel fitting. A healthy hydraulic system has a rhythm. Pumps speak through vibration. Valves answer through temperature. A mechanic who listens can hear lies inside metal. The return line was warmer than the supply line. That meant fluid was bypassing under load. I followed the hose to a pressure relief cartridge. The locking wire had been removed and replaced badly. Someone had backed the cartridge out by less than 1 turn. I took a grease pencil from my pocket and marked the original position. Then I tightened the cartridge, replaced the wire, and asked Mason to cycle the arm. The launcher rose smoothly. The timer had barely passed 3 minutes. Mason stared at the gauge. How did you know? He asked. I listened. Preston laughed too loudly. A lucky guess, he said. General Cole stood near the back with 2 colonels. One of them leaned toward her and whispered. She did not respond. She was watching the grease pencil in my hand. It had been cut flat on one side, so it would not roll off a vehicle in the field. Old Army habit. Preston recovered by announcing the next event. He handed me a tray containing 6 bridge locking pins. 5 were production-grade steel. 1 was a softer training replica. Pick the defective one, he said. No instruments. Dana smiled. This should be educational. I lifted each pin once. The training pin weighed slightly less, but not enough for most people to notice. The real difference was sound. I tapped each pin gently against the edge of the steel tray. 5 answered with a clear, tight ring. 1 returned a flat note. I set it aside. Preston's smile vanished. Curtis stepped forward. Anyone could see the color difference, he said. There was no visible color difference. I picked up the defective pin and turned it toward the morning light. Near the head was a shallow crescent-shaped mark. My breath slowed. The mark was no larger than a fingernail clipping. It had been made by a hardened center punch held at an angle. I knew it because my old mentor, Chief Warrant Officer Caleb Boone, had marked test articles that way for 20 years. Caleb died 11 months earlier when a prototype bridge hinge failed during a training evaluation in Kentucky. The Army vehicle he was guiding fell sideways into a dry channel. Caleb pushed a younger soldier clear and was crushed beneath the bridge module. The official report blamed an installation error. I never believed it. The damaged pin from that accident disappeared from the evidence cage 3 days after Caleb's funeral. Now its matching mark was sitting in my hand at my brother-in-law's resort. I kept my face still. Where did this come from? I asked. Curtis answered too quickly. Training stock. Which facility? He looked at Preston. Preston stepped between us. "Enough questions," he said. "Put it down." I placed the pin on the tray, but before I released it, I rubbed my thumb across the crescent mark. A trace of red inspection lacquer remained inside the indentation. Caleb always used red. The dead had just reached across 11 months and touched my hand. The real investigation had begun. Preston ended the pavilion event early and sent everyone to brunch. He claimed a software update was needed before the afternoon assembly exercise. Curtis gathered the pins and carried them toward a locked storage room. I watched him go. Then I walked to my truck. My green toolbox sat behind the passenger seat. It had belonged to Caleb before it belonged to me. The corners were dented. The paint was worn through near the handle, and one hinge squeaked no matter how often I oiled it. Inside were ordinary tools, a brass micrometer, a small inspection mirror, a flashlight, and a folded photograph from Caleb's last test. The photograph showed him beside the failed bridge module. He was grinning, holding a coffee cup, and pointing toward a row of pins laid on a canvas tarp. I had studied that picture until I could see it with my eyes closed. I unfolded it again. Every pin in the photograph carried the same red crescent. On the back, Caleb had written a sentence in block letters. "Heat numbers do not lie. People do. Steel is born with a history. The mill pours a batch and assigns it a heat number. That number follows the metal through cutting, forging, treatment, inspection, and final assembly. If a company changes a laboratory result, the paper can lie. If the heat number remains, the steel still remembers where it came from." The training pin Preston handed me had a faint number beneath the coating. I had seen only part of it, but part was enough. It matched the batch used in Caleb's fatal test. I took a small notebook from the toolbox and wrote 3 words: "Pin inside resort." A shadow moved across the open truck door. Paige stood behind me wearing jeans and a Holt staff jacket. She held 2 paper cups. "Coffee," she said. I accepted one. She looked toward the lodge. "Mom says I am not supposed to talk to you. Your mother has said that since you were 12. Paige almost smiled. Then her expression changed. "I heard Curtis and Preston arguing last night," she said. "Curtis said the old parts should have been destroyed. Preston told him they still needed them for the federal audit. Where were they?" "In the lower office behind the assembly bay. They did not know I was cleaning the conference room." "What else did you hear?" She pulled at the paper sleeve around her cup. "Preston said someone named Boone kept copies. Curtis said Boone was dead and the woman was harmless. The woman, I think they meant you." A cold line moved through my chest. Caleb had kept copies. Before he died, he mailed me a small envelope containing a brass key and no explanation. The key fit nothing in his home, his office, or his old truck. Army investigators had searched all 3. I carried it on a chain beneath my shirt. Paige looked at me. What did they do? I could have told her everything. I could have explained false test reports, forged inspections, and the death of a good man. But Paige was standing inside a company controlled by her parents. The less she knew, the safer she would be. "I need you to do one thing," I said. "Do not go near the lower office, do not search for anything, and do not let anyone know you spoke to me." She nodded. A black sedan rolled slowly past the parking area. Curtis sat in the passenger seat. He watched us through the window. Paige stepped away from my truck. "Too late," she whispered. The afternoon exercise took place on a gravel lot beside the inlet. Holt employees had to assemble a short bridge section by hand, connect the locking pins, and prepare it for launching. Preston divided the guests into teams. He placed me with 3 office workers and Paige. Then he assigned us the oldest equipment. Our hydraulic hand pump leaked. 1 alignment bar was bent. 2 pin bores had rust inside them. The other teams received new tools and experienced technicians. Dana stood beneath a sunshade holding a microphone. "This will show whether practical workers can compete with real engineers," she said. I looked at my team. 1 man worked in accounting. 1 woman managed travel. Paige handled public relations photographs. None had assembled a bridge. "We are not racing them," I said. "We are building something that must hold weight. Speed comes after correct work." The accountant looked toward Preston. "He will fire us if we lose. Then let us not lose." I gave each person 1 task. Paige cleaned the pin bores with a wire brush. The travel manager checked the locking clips. The accountant counted every washer and placed them in order. I straightened the alignment bar using the edge of a steel support and controlled pressure from the hand pump. The other teams moved quickly, too quickly. They slammed pins through misaligned holes with heavy hammers. They forced locking clips into grooves without checking whether the pins had seated fully. Preston praised their aggression. Metal does not care about aggression. Metal cares about alignment. When our first module would not close, I stopped the team. I ran my fingers along the hinge face and felt a burr near the lower bore. Someone had struck the steel with a chisel. The raised edge was enough to shift the joint. I used a flat file to remove it. Dana groaned into the microphone. "Evelyn is polishing the bridge," she said. "We may finish by Christmas." Laughter moved through the crowd. I kept filing. A few minutes later, our module closed with a clean, solid sound. The pin slid through under hand pressure. No hammer. No forcing. The locking clip seated fully. We completed the section after the other teams, but when the inspectors measured alignment, ours was the only one within specification. The first place team had damaged a pin groove. The second had installed 2 washers backward. The third could not release its joint because the pin had been driven in at an angle. Mason Lee announced the results. Preston took the microphone from him. "This was not a precision contest," he said. "It was a speed exercise." General Cole spoke from beneath the officer's tent. "A bridge that cannot be recovered is abandoned equipment," she said. "A bridge that cannot hold load is a funeral." No one laughed after that. Preston looked at me with open hatred. He had expected me to be a prop. Instead, every task was exposing the distance between his advertising and his engineering. That evening, he moved the family dinner from the lodge to a private deck overlooking the water. Only relatives and senior executives were invited. Paige found my name on a place card near the railing. For the first time, I had a seat at the family table. That worried me more than being excluded. My mother sat beside me. June touched my sleeve with 2 fingers. "You surprised everyone today," she said. I waited. She smiled. "Preston says there may be a position for you here after the Army finally lets you go. Something in maintenance. It would be nice to have you close, provided you learn how to behave around clients." There it was, an offer shaped like a leash. I am not looking for work. At your age, you should think about stability. I was 51. My mother spoke as if I were a confused teenager, and Dana were still the child who deserved the larger bedroom. My father leaned across the table. "Your sister has built something important," Vernon said. "You could show a little gratitude." "She married it," I said. Dana set down her fork. "I worked for this company from the beginning. You designed the logo." Her face hardened. Preston lifted one hand. "Family," he said. "Let us not ruin a pleasant evening." Then he placed a folder in front of me. Inside was a non-disclosure agreement and a consulting contract. The contract offered me $100,000 for 1 year. In exchange, I would agree that any technical comments I made during the weekend belonged to Holt Mobility Systems. I would also confirm that I had observed no safety issue affecting the Atlas span. I read every page. The language was careful. It did not ask me to lie directly. It asked me to surrender the right to tell the truth later. Preston poured wine into his glass. "Sign it," he said. "You could pay off that old truck and stop pretending the Army needs you." My father pushed his fountain pen toward me. The pen was black with a gold clip. He had used it to sign every important family document since I was a child. "You owe your sister this much," he said. I picked up the pen. Dana smiled. Then I turned the contract over and wrote one sentence across the blank back page. "I do not certify machines I have not tested." I placed the pen on top of the folder. Preston's eyes narrowed. "You think you are better than us because you wore a uniform?" "No." "Then what do you think?" I looked toward the bridge modules below. Floodlights shone across the steel. Workers moved between shadows. "I think a loaded bridge reveals every shortcut." The muscles in Curtis's jaw tightened. Preston closed the folder. "Be careful, Evelyn. People who make accusations without proof can lose everything. People who submit false claims to the government can lose 3 times what they took," I said. "They can also lose the right to compete for federal work." The deck went silent. That was the legal detail Preston hoped no one in the family understood. A company that knowingly bills the government using false records can face damages far beyond the original payment. Executives can also be suspended or excluded from future contracts while investigators review the fraud. My mother looked confused. Dana looked frightened. Preston leaned back and forced a smile. "Good thing nobody here has done that." I held his gaze. "Good thing." After dinner, I returned to my room and found the door open. Nothing looked disturbed at first. The bed remained made. My jacket hung over the chair. My suitcase sat where I had left it. Then I noticed the zipper. I always closed the two zipper pulls at the top center. Now they met near the lower right corner. Someone had searched my bag. The chain beneath my shirt still held Caleb's brass key. My notebook remained inside my boot where I had placed it before dinner. The toolbox was locked in my truck. They had found nothing. That meant they would try again. I turned off the lights and sat near the window. Below, the lower office behind the assembly bay glowed through one narrow pane. A man crossed in front of the light, then another. At midnight, the light went out. I waited another half hour. Then I left my room through the service stairs. The air near the lake was cool and damp. Insects moved around the floodlights. The bridge modules made small ticking sounds as the steel released heat from the day. I wore dark work clothes and carried no weapon. I did not need to break into the office. Federal investigators already had legal authority to collect company records under a sealed warrant scheduled to be served after the demonstration. My task was only to confirm whether the missing accident evidence was present and whether anyone attempted to destroy it. The lower office door had a new brass padlock. I took Caleb's key from beneath my shirt. It fit. For a moment, I simply held it there. Caleb had known. He had mailed me access to this room before his death, or to a lock that Holt later moved here. Either way, he had expected me to follow the trail. I opened the door. The office smelled of paper, cutting oil, and old cigarette smoke. Filing cabinets lined one wall. A steel workbench stood beneath a task light. On the floor was a wooden crate marked as scrap. I lifted the lid. Inside were 12 locking pins wrapped in oily cloth. Each carried a red crescent. I photographed the crate, the markings, and the room. Then I used my flashlight to read the heat numbers. They matched the batch from Caleb's accident. A file folder lay beneath the pins. It contained laboratory reports showing the steel had failed hardness requirements after heat treatment. Across the top page, someone had written rejected. A second report for the same heat number showed passing results. The signature at the bottom belonged to Mason Lee. I knew Mason had joined Holt only 4 months earlier. The passing report was dated more than a year ago. His signature had been forged. I heard footsteps outside. I turned off the flashlight and moved behind the open door. The padlock clicked against the metal latch. Curtis entered carrying a red fuel can. Preston followed with a cardboard box. They did not turn on the overhead light. Curtis used his phone. "We should have done this after Boone died," Curtis whispered. Preston placed the box on the workbench. "The audit team arrives tomorrow. Everything old goes tonight. What about Evelyn? She will be handled." "How?" Preston laughed softly. "She keeps a toolbox in that truck. By morning, the missing pin will be inside it. By noon, everyone will believe she sabotaged the demonstration because she resents Dana." Curtis lifted the fuel can, and the reports, "Burn them with the scrap. The fire will look electrical." My phone was recording from my shirt pocket. I waited until Preston opened the crate, then I stepped out from behind the door. "You should ventilate the room before using gasoline," I said. Curtis dropped the fuel can. It hit the concrete and rolled. Preston stumbled backward into the workbench. For 1 second, neither man spoke. Then Preston recovered. "What are you doing here? Looking for the restroom?" He glanced at the key in the lock. "Where did you get that?" "Caleb Boone." The name changed the room. Curtis's face lost color. Preston looked at the crate, then at me. "You have no idea what you are touching," he said. "I know the heat number. I know the first report failed. I know Mason's signature was forged. And now I know you plan to plant a pin in my truck." Curtis moved toward me. He was taller and 20 years younger. He expected me to step back. I did not. Preston raised one hand. "Not here," he said. Curtis stopped. Preston looked at my shirt pocket. "Give me your phone." "No." His voice became softer. "Evelyn, think carefully. Your parents are old. Dana has a daughter. If this company collapses, hundreds of people lose their jobs. Caleb is dead. Nothing brings him back. There are sentences a person remembers forever. Caleb is dead was one. Nothing brings him back was another. They were true, but Preston used them as permission. A dead man could not complain about stolen evidence. A dead man could not defend his name. A dead man could be blamed for the defect that killed him. I stepped closer to the crate. "Caleb died, saving a soldier from a failure you hid." Preston's mouth tightened. It was a test accident. It was a predictable result. You cannot prove that. I looked at the red fuel can on the floor. You were about to help me. Curtis lunged for my pocket. I caught his wrist, turned my body, and guided his arm past me. His momentum carried him into the edge of the workbench. The impact knocked the air from his chest. I released him immediately. He spun around, furious. Preston blocked him again. "Let her go," he said. That surprised Curtis. It did not surprise me. Preston needed time. If I disappeared or arrived injured before the federal demonstration, suspicion would fall on him. His plan required a public story, a planted object, and witnesses willing to believe the worst about me. He smiled. "Get some sleep, Evelyn. Tomorrow will be difficult for you." I walked out with my phone still in my pocket. I left the pin crate where it was. Taking evidence without the collection team could create questions about custody. Instead, I sent the recording and photographs through an encrypted channel to the lead agent waiting off-site. The response came less than a minute later. "Proceed with controlled demonstration. Safety measures confirmed. Warrant team in position." The Army already knew the live Atlas band contained suspect pins. Earlier that week, test personnel had installed secondary support barges and limited the demonstration to an unmanned vehicle. Sensors would record the failure without risking a crew. Preston believed the Army was preparing to approve his bridge. The Army was preparing to let his lies carry weight. When I returned to the lodge, Paige was sitting on the floor outside my room. Her eyes were red. "Mom knows I talked to you," she said. "What happened?" She took my staff badge. She said, "I am staying in her room until the demonstration is over." "You are 23. I know. Then why are you sitting here?" Paige looked toward the empty hallway. "'Cause I stole this first." She handed me a small memory card. I found it in Preston's desk last month. It has video from the Kentucky test. I was afraid to watch it. I closed my hand around the card. "Why did you take it?" "Because he told Mom to delete everything from that date. And because he looked happy when he said the investigation was over." I opened my room door and let her inside. The video was short. It showed Caleb beside the prototype bridge on the morning he died. The camera had been left running during a private discussion near the launcher. Preston entered the frame with Curtis. Their voices were faint but clear. Caleb told them the pins had not been properly treated. He ordered the test stopped. Preston refused. The company needed a successful result before a loan meeting the following Monday. Curtis said the bridge would probably hold one pass. Caleb said probably was not an engineering standard. Then Preston spoke the sentence that turned an accident into a crime. "Run it anyway. If anything bends, we replace the pin and call it operator error." The video ended before the collapse. Paige covered her mouth. "He knew," she whispered. "Yes. My mother said Caleb made a mistake. Your mother repeated what protected the family." Paige began to cry without sound. I sat beside her. "You did the right thing. I stole from my stepfather. You preserved evidence of a death. What happens now?" "The truth gets heavy." She looked at me. "What does that mean?" "It means people who carried lies for years will suddenly ask you to help them set the weight down. You are not required to lift it for them." I copied the memory card and transmitted the video to investigators. Then I gave the original back to Paige. "Keep it with you until a federal agent asks for it," I said. "Do not give it to your mother. Do not give it to Preston. If anyone tries to take it, call this number." I wrote the agent's number on the back of a hotel receipt. Paige folded it into her pocket. "On Evie, why did you come alone?" I thought about that. "Because my family mistakes quiet for alone." She wiped her face. "Are they wrong?" "Completely." I slept for 2 hours. Before dawn, I walked to the shoreline and watched fog gather over the temporary bridge. Work lights glowed beneath the steel. The lake was dark and flat. Somewhere across the water, a boat motor started and faded. Caleb used to say the hardest moment in any investigation came after you knew the truth, but before everyone else had to face it. Evidence makes a private certainty. Consequences require public weight. I carried both that morning. At breakfast, my family behaved as if nothing had happened. Preston sat at the head of the table reading messages on his phone. Dana wore a white suit chosen for cameras. My parents were dressed as if they were attending church. Paige's chair was empty. My mother poured coffee for me. "You look tired," June said. "Long night." Preston glanced up. "Walking around places you do not belong can be exhausting." My father folded his newspaper. "Evelyn, we need to settle something before the guests arrive." Dana placed the unsigned consulting contract beside my plate. Sign it, she said. No. Her voice dropped. Do you understand what you are doing to us? I buttered a piece of toast. Nothing has happened to you yet? Preston put down his phone. This is your final chance to be reasonable. Reasonable was the word my family used whenever they wanted surrender to sound mature. I looked at each of them. My mother had ignored spilled wine on my clothes. My father had demanded I apologize for being humiliated. Dana had allowed her daughter to be threatened because Paige showed me kindness. Preston had tried to burn evidence from a dead soldier's case. They did not want peace. They wanted silence with my signature beneath it. I pushed the folder back. My father struck the table with his palm. For once in your life, think about someone besides yourself. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked him a question. Did you make the prototype pins? His face changed. It was small, a tightening around the eyes, a pause before breath. Preston answered for him. Vernon has not worked in production for years. I kept looking at my father. Did you make them? He stared at his coffee. I helped with an early batch, he said. Preston needed someone who understood the old machines. Did you see the heat treatment records? Dana stood. Stop interrogating him. Vernon rubbed one thumb against the edge of the table. The furnace chart was wrong, he whispered. My mother turned toward him. What are you saying? He swallowed. The temperature fell during the cycle. A burner failed. I told Curtis the batch needed to be treated again. Preston's chair scraped backward. You are confused, old man. My father looked at him. You said the laboratory would check it. It did. No. You brought me a new chart and asked me to initial it. Dana's face went pale. Dad, did you sign something? Vernon said nothing. My mother's hand moved to her chest. For the first time in my life, I saw my father understand that loyalty to the golden child had not made him part of her success. It had made him useful evidence. Preston leaned across the table. Listen to me. You helped calibrate a furnace. That is all. Do not invent stories because Evelyn is frightening you. I reached into my pocket and placed my brass micrometer on the table. The tool caught the morning light. My father recognized it. That belonged to Caleb, he said. Yes, he gave it to you. After his death. Vernon looked at the instrument for a long time. Then he whispered, I measured one of the rejected pins with that tool. Caleb was there. The head had swollen after the load test. He told Preston the batch was unsafe. Preston stood so quickly his coffee tipped over. Enough! Brown liquid spread across the white tablecloth. My mother stared at him. You told us Caleb installed it wrong. Preston grabbed the contract folder. This conversation is over, he pointed at me. You will stay away from the demonstration area until security clears you. If you interfere with one piece of equipment, I will have you arrested. I closed the micrometer and returned it to my pocket. That was always the plan, I said. He froze. For half a second, I thought he understood how much I knew. Then Dana stepped between us. Get out, she said to me. You have hated me since we were children. You could not stand that I built a life while you hid in repair shops and barracks. I stood. You did build a life, Dana. You built it on people you never bothered to inspect. She slapped me. My head turned with the force. The room went silent. My mother looked away. My father did not move. Preston smiled. I touched the inside of my cheek with my tongue. I tasted blood. Then I looked at Dana. Paige preserved the Kentucky video. The color left her face. What video? Ask your husband. I walked out before Preston could answer. The morning program included a route survey along the rocky shoreline. Executives and Army guests would inspect the Atlas span from the abutment to the floating center sections. Preston had assigned me to carry a field sample case weighing more than 60 pounds. The case should have been moved by 2 people. Curtis handed it to me alone. Government workers need exercise, he said. The handle had been partly cut near one attachment point. I saw the pale line in the black rubber. If it failed on the slope, the case could crush a foot or pull me into the water. I took a cargo strap from a utility cart and built a second support around the case. Curtis watched without speaking. We started down the trail. The shoreline was steep in places, with loose limestone under wet leaves. Dana walked near the front beside General Cole. Preston explained bridge features with the confidence of a man who had never assembled one. I carried the case at the back. Halfway down the slope, the damaged handle broke. The case dropped less than an inch before the cargo strap caught it. Curtis looked over his shoulder. I raised the broken handle so he could see the cut. His expression answered every question. General Cole stopped near the water. "Chief," she said without turning around, "bring that case forward." The word chief moved through the group. Dana looked at me. Preston laughed. "She calls every maintenance worker chief. Army habit." General Cole turned. "No, Mr. Holt, I do not." A colonel beside her hid a smile. I set the case on a flat rock and opened it. Inside were steel samples, inspection tools, and a portable hardness tester. The equipment did not belong to Holt. It belonged to the Army. Preston stared at the inventory label. "How did that get here?" General Cole answered. "We brought it." Curtis took one step backward. The general lifted a bridge pin from the sample rack. "Our team will conduct independent checks before the demonstration," she said. "Chief Maddox will lead them." Dana laughed once, a short, nervous sound. "Evelyn cannot lead an Army test. She is a mechanic." General Cole looked at her. "Your sister is a Chief Warrant Officer 5 with more than 30 years of service. She has investigated mobility system failures on 3 continents. When a bridge, recovery vehicle, or launch system fails under load, senior commanders ask her why." The lake wind moved through the trees. My father's face went slack. My mother gripped Dana's arm. "Preston recovered first." "That is impossible. She would have told us." I looked at him. "You never asked a question long enough to hear the answer." General Cole handed me the pin. "Proceed, Chief." I placed the pin beneath the portable tester. The instrument pressed a hardened tip into the steel and measured resistance. The result appeared on a small screen. Below, minimum hardness. I tested a second pin. Below minimum. A third. Below minimum. Mason Lee stood near the bridge control cabinet. His hands began to shake. Preston pointed at him. "This engineer certified those parts." Mason looked up. "I did not," he said. "Your signature is on the report." I joined the company after the date on that report. Every face turned toward Curtis. He moved toward the trail. 2 federal agents stepped from behind the command vehicle. "Not yet," General Cole said. They stopped, but remained between Curtis and the road. Preston looked at the officers, the agents, and the instruments. He understood the weekend was no longer his event. Then he did what frightened men with power often do. He reached for a larger lie. "This is retaliation," he said. "Evelyn has been planning this because our family refused to support her unstable military lifestyle. She had access to the equipment all night. She could have changed the pins." Dana seized the story immediately. "She was wandering near the assembly bay after midnight. Staff saw her." Curtis nodded. "And she threatened us." My mother looked at General Cole. "Evelyn has always had anger problems." My father said nothing. The old family machine was moving again. One person spoke the lie. Another polished it. A third supplied concern. By the end, cruelty wore the clothing of responsibility. General Cole watched me. I gave the smallest nod. We were not ready to arrest them yet. The controlled load test would prove the material defect in front of witnesses and preserve sensor data that no family story could erase. General Cole closed the sample case. "The demonstration will proceed without personnel on the bridge," she said. "Army safety officers control the site from this point forward." Preston objected. "This is my equipment. It is being presented for federal evaluation," she replied. "You may withdraw from testing if you choose." He could not. Withdrawal would trigger questions from lenders and investors. His entire company depended on a successful public crossing. He forced a smile. "Proceed." As the group returned uphill, my father fell into step beside me. "I am sorry," he said quietly. I kept walking. "I did not know your rank." There it was. Not, "I am sorry I let them hurt you." Not, "I am sorry I helped falsify a record." He was sorry because my value had changed in his eyes. Would it have mattered, I asked? He opened his mouth. No answer came. At the top of the slope, Paige stood beside a woman in a dark federal jacket. She had given the original memory card to the investigation team. Dana saw her. "Paige, get over here." Paige did not move. Dana's voice sharpened. "I am your mother." Paige looked at me, then at General Cole, then back at Dana. "You were also the person who told me to delete proof that a man died," she said. Dana stopped walking. The words landed harder than any slap. Paige stepped beside the agent. For the first time, her shoulders were straight. The demonstration began just before noon. White chairs faced the lake. Television crews stood behind rope lines. Investors gathered beneath the main tent. The Atlas span floated across the inlet, its sections joined by the suspect pins. Beneath the center joint, safety barges waited out of sight from most cameras. An unmanned test vehicle sat at the near end. It had been loaded to the contract weight with steel blocks and fitted with remote controls. Preston took the stage. He spoke about innovation, sacrifice, and American manufacturing. He thanked my parents for raising two strong daughters. He even mentioned me by name. My sister Evelyn has devoted her life to service, he said. Today, our family's shared commitment moves forward together. That was how people like Preston used language. They did not apologize. They revised the past while everyone was still standing in it. I stood near the control trailer with General Cole and the test team. Sensors measured strain through each joint. Cameras focused on the pinheads. The remote vehicle would stop at 4 positions while engineers recorded the load. The first crossing point held, the second held. At the third, the center pins began to deform. A red line climbed across the monitor. Mason whispered, "That is too much movement." I knew. Caleb must have seen the same line 11 months earlier. He had stood beside another bridge, told another group of men to stop, and been ignored. The remote vehicle moved forward. The strain rose. Preston watched the crowd instead of the bridge. He was smiling for cameras. Curtis watched the exit. Dana watched me. My mother held my father's hand. The pin at the center joint bent, not enough to see from the shore, enough for the sensors to scream. I reached for the stop control. General Cole covered my hand with hers. "One more foot," she said. The safety structure was ready. The data needed a complete failure signature. I thought of Caleb beneath twisted steel. I thought of Paige sitting outside my room. I thought of my father's fountain pen beside a false contract. Then I thought of every young soldier who might cross an Atlas span in darkness, under fire, trusting that someone had told the truth about the metal beneath the tires. This was not revenge. Revenge looks backward. Duty looks toward the person who has not been hurt yet. If you believe protecting that unknown person matters more than protecting a powerful family's reputation, stand with me now. Subscribe and write the words "duty before comfort" in the comments. What happened next did not just end a contract. It forced every person on that shore to choose which truth they could live with. General Cole lifted her hand. I pressed the control. The test vehicle moved one final foot. The center pin sheared. The sound was sharp and clean, like a rifle crack across open water. One bridge section twisted. The joint opened. Steel plates folded toward the safety barges. The unmanned vehicle tilted and stopped against restraint cables. Water rose in a wide white sheet. People screamed and backed away. Preston spun toward the bridge. "No," he said. The second pin failed. The center section dropped onto the hidden support barge with a crushing metallic roar. Every sensor screen filled with red. The bridge had carried less than one full crossing. Preston ran toward the control trailer. "She did this," he shouted. Evelyn changed the pins. "Arrest her." Dana followed him. "Search her truck," she said. "She keeps tools there." "She has hated us for years." My mother pointed at me. She was always jealous of Dana. The story arrived exactly on schedule. 2 private security guards moved toward me. Preston handed them plastic restraints. General Cole did not stop them. That had been part of the plan, too. We needed Preston to complete the frame in public. One guard pulled my hands behind my back. The restraint tightened around my wrists. Dana stepped close and slapped me. "She is not a soldier," she told the cameras. "She changes oil in an army garage and tells people she is important." Preston ordered the truck searched. Curtis ran to the parking area with another guard. A minute later, they returned carrying my green toolbox. Curtis set it on the stage and opened it with a key. Not my key, a copied key. He removed a black steel pin wrapped in an evidence bag. Preston raised it before the crowd. "Here is the stolen part," he shouted. Then he reached beneath the tray in the toolbox and removed a second pin. That one carried Caleb's red crescent. For the first time, Preston's hand trembled. He had expected one planted pin. He did not know federal agents had placed the original accident evidence inside my toolbox that morning under recorded custody. They had dusted the bag, marked the seal, and filmed every person who approached my truck. Curtis had opened the truck. Curtis had handled the planted pin. Curtis had handled the evidence bag. The trap closed around them while they celebrated. Behind us, The collapsed bridge settled onto the barges. Major General Cole stood. "Nobody move," she said. She walked to the stage and examined the red crescent. Then she turned toward the agents. "Cut, Chief Maddox, free. That pin is evidence from the fatal Kentucky accident, and she is the lead failure investigator assigned to this case." The restraint fell from my wrists. Preston stared at me. General Cole faced the cameras. "Chief Warrant Officer 5, Evelyn Maddox, has served the United States Army for more than 30 years. She has led technical investigations involving bridge systems, recovery platforms, and combat mobility equipment. She did not sabotage this test. She helped design the safety plan that prevented injuries today." Dana looked from the general to me. "Maddox," she whispered. It was my married name. My husband, Daniel Maddox, had died of cancer 6 years earlier. My family still called me Mercer because accepting my chosen name would have meant admitting I had built a life beyond them. Preston lifted the pin. "This proves nothing." I stepped onto the stage. "It proves more than you think." I held out my hand. He did not give me the pin. A federal agent took it from him and placed it on the table. I opened my brass micrometer. The crowd watched the small jaws close around the bent head of the pin. The diameter exceeded specification. Then I showed the heat number to the cameras. "This number matches the batch used in the Kentucky failure that killed Chief Caleb Boone," I said. Holt's first laboratory report rejected that batch. A second report changed the result and carried the forged signature of an engineer who did not yet work for the company. Mason stepped forward. "That is not my signature," I continued. Last night, Preston Holt and Curtis Vane entered a locked office containing the rejected pins and original reports. They brought gasoline and discussed burning the records. They also discussed placing a pin in my truck so they could accuse me of sabotage today. Curtis looked toward the road. Agents blocked it. Preston laughed, but the sound had no strength. "You have no recording." The command trailer speakers came alive. His own voice moved across the shore. "By morning, the missing pin will be inside it. By noon, everyone will believe she sabotaged the demonstration because she resents Dana." The recording ended. The silence afterward was vast. Preston turned toward Curtis. "You were supposed to check her phone." Curtis answered before he understood what he was saying. "You told me not to touch her in the office." Another confession, delivered without help. Dana stepped backward. "Preston, what did you do?" He looked at her as if she were stupid. "What I had to do to save your life. My life. The company. The house. Everything. Do you think your mother's jewelry pays for itself? Do you think your father gets invited anywhere without my name? Do you think Paige's education appeared from the sky?" Paige stood beside the agent. "My scholarship paid for school," she said. Preston ignored her. He pointed at my parents. "All of you wanted this. Do not stand there and pretend you cared how it was built." My mother began to cry. My father looked older than he had that morning. General Cole turned to the lead agent. "Proceed." The federal agents moved toward Preston and Curtis. Curtis raised both hands immediately. Preston did not. He looked at the collapsed bridge, the cameras, the investors, and the soldiers who no longer saw a successful contractor. They saw a man standing beside the weight of his own decisions. His face changed. The polished executive disappeared. What remained was the frightened boy beneath the suit, the one who believed losing status was the same as dying. He grabbed the steel pin from the table and swung it toward my head. I saw his shoulder move before the pin left the table. I stepped inside the arc, caught his wrist with both hands, and turned the joint toward the floor. The pin struck the stage. Preston dropped to one knee. I kept pressure on his wrist until an agent secured his other arm. I did not hit him. I did not need to. As the agents pulled him upright, he looked at my parents. "Tell them," he shouted. "Tell them Evelyn has always been unstable." My mother covered her face. My father stared at the micrometer in my hand. Dana stood alone between them. Preston called her name. She did not answer. The agents led him past the front row. Investors moved their chairs out of his path. Men who had shaken his hand that morning turned their bodies away. The senator's aide removed a Holt badge from his jacket and placed it beneath his seat. Curtis followed in restraints. When he passed Mason, he lowered his eyes. The lead agent collected the planted pin, the copied truck key, and a marked evidence bag. Another team moved toward the lower office with the warrant. The bridge test data was copied to federal servers before anyone from Holt could touch the controls. General Cole approached my father. "Did you alter the furnace chart?" she asked. Vernon shook his head. "I initialed the replacement chart. Preston said the laboratory had approved it. Did you know the original batch failed?" His mouth moved, but no sound came. I answered for him. He knew the furnace cycle failed. He did not know Caleb would die. After the accident, he accepted Preston's explanation because the alternative required courage. My father flinched. General Cole studied him. "An investigator will take your statement." My mother stepped toward me. "Evelyn, please." I looked at her. She had tears on her cheeks now. I had seen my mother cry at weddings, funerals, television dramas, and damaged furniture. Tears were real feelings, but they were not always proof of love. Sometimes they were only proof that the person crying had lost control of the ending. "We did not know," she said. "You knew how you treated me. That is not the same thing. No. It is the part you cannot blame on Preston." Dana made a broken sound. "I thought he was protecting us." "From what?" She looked around at the ruined demonstration. "From losing everything." Paige stepped closer. "You were willing to lose me," she said. Dana turned. "Never. You took my badge, locked me in your room, and told me to delete a dead man's last warning. I was scared." "So was he," Paige said, looking toward the bridge. "Caleb was scared, and he still told the truth." Dana had no answer. My father sat in one of the white chairs, the paper program folded beneath his hand. He looked toward the collapsed span where safety crews were securing the steel. "I should have stopped the batch," he whispered. "Yes. I should have called someone after the accident. Yes." He looked at me. "Can you forgive me?" The old version of me might have rushed to soften the moment. I might have told him he had been manipulated. I might have carried part of his guilt because daughters and families like mine are trained to lift what the men drop. I did not do that. "Forgiveness is not a ladder out of consequence," I said. "Tell the investigators the whole truth, then live with what your choices cost." My mother reached for my hand. I stepped back. "Do not touch me." Her arm fell to her side. There was no pleasure in saying it. Boundaries do not need pleasure. They need clarity. General Cole placed a hand on my shoulder. "Chief, the test team needs your assessment." I turned away from my family and walked toward the lake. For the next 6 hours I worked. We photographed every fracture surface, we tagged each pin, we recorded the direction of deformation, and compared it with the sensor timeline. The failed steel showed the grain pattern of improper heat treatment. The bridge had not been sabotaged by removal or cutting. It had failed because Holt placed weak pins inside a system designed to carry extreme load. Metal had told the truth. Near sunset, recovery crews lifted the center section from the barges. Water poured from the steel in silver sheets. Beneath one joint, we found a red crescent pressed into the pinhead, Caleb's mark. I held it for a moment before placing it in the evidence container. General Cole stood beside me. "He knew someone would look," she said. "He knew you would." The sun dropped behind the Ozark Hills. The lake turned copper, then gray. I had spent 11 months wanting Caleb's death to make sense. It never would. Preventable deaths do not become reasonable when the paperwork is complete. The best an investigation can do is refuse to let the lie become permanent. That night, I returned to the lodge for my bag. The ballroom was empty. Staff had removed the Holt banners. Half-packed boxes stood near the walls. The antler chandelier cast long shadows across tables that had looked grand the night before. My mother waited near the kitchen doors. She held the brown jacket Curtis had stained with wine. Someone had cleaned it. "I brought this for you," she said. I took the jacket but did not put it on. "Your father is giving a statement. Dana is with Paige." "Good." June looked toward the center table. "I do love you. I believe you feel something you call love." Her face tightened. "That is cruel." "No. Cruel was watching people humiliate your daughter because their approval mattered more than her dignity. This is accurate." She began to cry again. "Will I ever see you?" I considered the question. "Not until your apology stops asking me to make you feel better." I walked past her. Outside, Paige stood beside my old truck. She held Caleb's green toolbox. "The agents are finished with it," she said. I placed it behind the passenger seat. Paige looked toward the lodge. "Mom wants me to come home with her." "What do you want?" "I want to stay with a friend until I decide." "Then do that." She took a folded paper from her pocket. I found this in the toolbox after the agents returned it. It was a letter in Caleb's handwriting. Evie, if this key reaches you, I ran out of time. The failed parts are being moved through Holt's private site. Vernon saw the furnace problem. I do not know whether he understands what Preston plans to do with it. Trust the heat numbers. Trust your training. Most of all, do not let family make you doubt what the steel says. There was one more line. Measure twice. Carry no lie once. I read it again. Paige waited quietly. Are you all right? She asked. No. She nodded as if that answer made sense. Then neither of us is alone, she said. That was the first warm thing I felt all day. I drove away from Cedar Ridge Lodge before midnight. No helicopter came for me. No parade waited at the gate. My truck still knocked at low speed. The passenger windows still needed help, and my cheeks still ached where Dana had slapped me. But the toolbox beside me held Caleb's letter. The road ahead was dark and ordinary. Freedom often is. In the months that followed, Holt Mobility Systems lost its Atlas contract and was suspended from new federal work while the investigation continued. The government pursued damages based on the false certifications and the money already billed. Lenders seized company assets. The private aircraft disappeared first, then the lake house, then the factory equipment that had been pledged twice. Preston was charged with procurement fraud, obstruction, evidence tampering, and assault. Curtis agreed to cooperate after investigators showed him the recording from the lower office and the video of him opening my truck. Mason's forged signature was formally cleared. My father admitted he had initialed the false furnace chart. His cooperation reduced his legal exposure, but it did not erase what he had done. He wrote me 7 letters. I returned the first 6 unopened. I read the 7th because the envelope contained no request for forgiveness. It said only this. I chose comfort over truth. Caleb paid for it. You paid for it. I am telling the investigators everything, even the parts that make me look weak. I do not expect you to answer. I did not answer. But I kept the letter. My mother sent flowers to my office. I donated them to the hospital where Daniel had received treatment. Dana left 3 voice messages. In the first, she blamed Preston. In the second, she blamed our parents. In the third, she finally said she had enjoyed watching me be excluded because it made her feel secure. That was the first honest thing she had given me. I still did not call back. Paige moved into a small apartment near Springfield and took a job with an engineering nonprofit that repaired rural bridges. We spoke every Sunday evening. She never asked me to reconcile with her mother. She understood that love can hope for change without volunteering to be injured during the process. The Army completed its final report the following spring. The Atlas failure was traced to inadequate heat treatment, falsified laboratory data, and a deliberate decision to proceed despite known risk. Caleb Boone was cleared of operator error. His actions were credited with saving the younger soldier who survived the Kentucky collapse. At the memorial ceremony, General Cole handed Caleb's widow a framed copy of the corrected finding. I stood in the back row. Afterward, she found me near the chapel steps and pressed Caleb's old center punch into my hand. The tip still carried a trace of red lacquer. He would want you to have it, she said. I closed my fingers around the worn steel. A year after the demonstration, I received an invitation in the mail. It was not from my parents. It was from Paige. She had entered a graduate engineering program and joined the Army Reserve. Her commissioning ceremony would take place on a Saturday morning at a small armory outside Springfield. At the bottom of the card, she had written a question. Will you pin my bars? I arrived early wearing my dress uniform. Paige stood beneath the flag in a new uniform that still held the sharp folds from the tailor. Dana sat in the last row. My parents sat beside her. They did not approach me. For once, they understood that attendance did not create entitlement. When Paige's name was called, she stepped forward. I pinned 1 gold bar to her shoulder. General Cole pinned the other. Paige took the oath with a steady voice. After the ceremony, she handed me a small wooden box. Inside was a new brass micrometer, engraved with Caleb's sentence. Heat numbers do not lie. People do. I looked at her. This belongs to you, I said. Not yet. I bought 2. She opened her uniform pocket and showed me the second one. For the first time in a long time, I laughed. We walked outside together. Morning light rested on the parked cars. My old truck sat between 2 polished sedans, still carrying dust from the road. Paige placed her new officer cap on the dashboard and climbed into the passenger seat. The window stuck halfway down. She pulled it once, then looked at me. You really should fix this. I started the engine. Listen first, I said. The motor settled into its familiar knock. Paige tilted her head. Loose heat shield. Good answer. We drove toward town for breakfast. In the mirror, I saw my family standing outside the armory. They looked smaller than I remembered, but not because I had become more important. They looked smaller because I had finally stopped measuring myself against them. Blood had given me relatives. Duty had given me direction. Truth had given Caleb his name back. And respect had given me a family I could choose. The road curved through green hills. Paige lowered the stubborn window with both hands. Fresh air filled the cab. For the first time, the sound of that old truck did not feel like something arriving in the wrong place. It sounded like home.